The morning sun reflected off the glass skyscrapers, casting long shadows across the busy city streets. Andrew Foster's shoes clicked against the pavement, the sound muffled by the city's hustle. He was a man with a plan, as always. A morning meeting with investors, followed by lunch at the club, and later a cocktail event that would land him a multi-million-dollar deal. Everything in his life was about precision, timing, and control. Andrew prided himself on never missing a beat. His pristine suit, his sleek leather briefcase, the watch on his wrist ticking in perfect synchronization with his fast-paced world. People moved out of his way as if instinctively knowing not to interrupt him. He exuded the kind of confidence that made heads turn, the kind of wealth that commanded respect. But today, something felt off. As Andrew reached for his wallet to pay for his usual morning coffee at a small cafe on the corner, a sudden chill ran down his spine. He patted his coat pocket, empty. His chest pocket, empty. Panic flared in his chest as he checked his pants pockets. Gone. His heart raced. That wallet wasn't just a holder of cards and cash. It was his identity, his security. His mind buzzed with the worst possibilities. Someone could be draining his accounts, gaining access to his contacts, his life. Everything felt as if it were slipping out of control. "Is something wrong, sir?" the barista asked, her brow furrowed as Andrew stood frozen in front of the counter, his usual confident demeanor unraveling. I've lost my wallet," Andrew said, his voice barely concealing the panic. He ran through his memory, replaying his steps over the last hour. The last time he had it was when he'd tipped the valet at the hotel. That was just a few blocks away. Without another word, he turned on his heel and hurried out of the cafe, retracing his steps. His pulse throbbed in his ears as he scanned the busy streets, looking for the small brown leather wallet that had become a lifeline over the years. Meanwhile, a few blocks away, Jack sat slumped on a bench at the park, watching the world pass him by. He'd been invisible for years now. The people who crossed his path never saw him. They saw his worn-out coat, the tangled mess of his hair, his unshaven face, everything that said he was a man who had given up. What they didn't see was the man behind those layers of wear, the man who had once worn a uniform, fought for his country, and had dreams of his own. Jack's fingers idly fiddled with the edge of a worn newspaper when something caught his eye. A small wallet lying on the ground just a few feet away. He frowned, reaching out and picking it up. It was heavy, made of soft leather, and definitely not the kind of thing someone like him would carry. Curious, he opened it, expecting to find a couple of bills or maybe some loose change. What he found was far more valuable. Inside, the wallet was packed with crisp $100 bills, a black American Express card, and a photo. A photo of a smiling family, 2 kids, and a well-dressed man standing by a pristine house. Jack stared at the picture for a moment, his mind wandering back to a time when he, too, had a life that seemed perfect. Before the war, before the losses, before everything crumbled. He glanced around, his instinct telling him to pocket the money and move on. After all, who would ever know? A man with this much wealth wouldn't miss a few $100s. It could change things for Jack, at least for a little while. But something stopped him. The picture of the family nagged at him. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about doing what was right. Jack sighed, knowing exactly what he had to do. He got up from the bench, wallet in hand, and began walking toward the address on the business card inside. Foster Enterprises, one of the biggest financial firms in the city. As Jack walked through the city streets, blending into the background like always, Andrew's world was spiraling. He stood in front of his office building, his phone pressed to his ear as he canceled credit cards and tried to keep a calm facade. His assistant stood nearby, giving him concerned glances as he barked orders into the phone. "I don't care how much it costs. I need those cards replaced by this afternoon. I have a meeting, and I can't afford any delays," Andrew snapped, hanging up the call. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, frustration bubbling up inside him. How could he have let this happen? He never lost things. He never lost control. But as the elevator doors opened, revealing a man in worn clothes holding a familiar-looking wallet, Andrew's irritation was replaced by something else entirely. "I believe this belongs to you," Jack said, holding out the wallet with a slight smile. Andrew stared at him in disbelief. You found it?" Jack nodded, handing over the wallet. Andrew quickly thumbed through it, checking that everything was still inside. Nothing was missing. Not the cash, not the cards. He looked up at Jack, his mind racing. Who was this man, and why hadn't he just kept the money? "Thank you," Andrew said, his voice softer now, the relief evident. He reached into the wallet, pulling out several bills. "Here, take this, as a reward." Jack shook his head, stepping back. "I don't want your money, just wanted to make sure it got back to its owner." Andrew frowned, confused. "Why? You could have kept it." Jack shrugged, his eyes tired but honest. "I've learned the hard way that doing the right thing doesn't always pay in cash." With that, Jack turned to leave, but something in Andrew stopped him. There was something about the man's quiet dignity, something that gnawed at Andrew's curiosity. "Wait," he called after him. "At least let me buy you lunch. I insist." Jack paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "You don't owe me anything." "I know," Andrew replied, "but I want to." Jack hesitated at Andrew's offer, his eyes scanning the pristine, glass-covered building where Andrew worked. The sharp lines of wealth and power radiated from the structure, a world far removed from Jack's own. But something in Andrew's voice, maybe a flicker of genuine curiosity, pulled Jack back. He wasn't used to people wanting anything from him, let alone a meal. "All right," Jack said slowly, almost as if he were testing the waters, "but just lunch. Nothing more." Andrew nodded and gestured toward the sleek black sedan waiting at the curb. "My driver will take us. I know a place not far from here." Jack gave the car a dubious glance but followed Andrew into the back seat. The difference in their worlds couldn't have been more glaring. While Andrew was tapping away on his phone, sending last-minute emails and coordinating his next meeting, Jack sat in silence, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The hum of the car's engine seemed to echo the awkwardness that filled the space between them. They arrived at an upscale restaurant, one Jack never would have set foot in on his own. The doorman greeted Andrew by name and gave Jack a look that was somewhere between suspicion and pity. Jack ignored it. He'd gotten used to looks like that, looks that said he didn't belong. Inside, the restaurant was all polished wood and soft lighting, the kind of place where the clink of cutlery was delicate, and the conversations were murmurs among well-dressed diners. Jack suddenly felt self-conscious. His worn jacket and faded jeans stood out like a sore thumb among the suits and evening dresses. Andrew led him to a quiet corner table and sat down, gesturing for Jack to do the same. "Order whatever you like," Andrew said, waving at the menu that was filled with words Jack didn't recognize. "It's on me." Jack glanced at the menu, scanning the foreign names of dishes. He felt like a fish out of water, but he quickly settled on something simple. A steak, medium rare. It had been a long time since he'd had anything more than sandwiches and canned food. They ordered, and as the waiter left, silence fell between them again, heavy and uncomfortable. Jack didn't want to be here. He wasn't some charity case, but he'd returned the wallet because it was the right thing to do. And now he found himself sitting across from a man who probably spent more on this lunch than Jack had made in a month when things were good. "I don't know how to thank you," Andrew started, leaning forward with a slight smile. "I've been thinking about what would have happened if someone else had found that wallet. Not everyone would have brought it back." Jack shrugged, avoiding Andrew's gaze. "I didn't do it for thanks." Andrew studied Jack for a moment, intrigued by his bluntness. Most people would have taken the money, and if they returned it, they would have definitely taken the reward. But Jack was different, and that difference gnawed at Andrew's curiosity. He wanted to know more. "So, what's your story?" Andrew asked, trying to keep the tone light but probing. "How did you end up here? Jack looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "That's a long story," he muttered, his voice thick with weariness. "We have time," Andrew replied with a smile, though there was an underlying urgency in his voice. Jack could sense that Andrew wasn't just making conversation, he wanted answers. Jack let out a long breath and leaned back in his chair. He hadn't talked about his past in a while, and certainly not to someone like Andrew, but there was something about the businessman's persistence that made him feel like maybe it was time to say something. Just a little. "I wasn't always like this," Jack began, his voice steady but low. "I served in the military for 15 years, did 2 tours overseas. When I came back, things were different." Andrew raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" Jack sighed, rubbing a hand across his weathered face. "Coming back from war changes things. People. I wasn't the same, and neither was life here. My wife—" His voice trailed off, and for a moment the weight of his words hung in the air. "She left. I don't blame her, really. I was lost. Couldn't find my place anymore. It felt like the world moved on without me, and I was just stuck." Andrew was silent, his usual confidence faltering as Jack's words hit him. He didn't expect to hear something so raw, so real. The corporate world Andrew lived in didn't have room for stories like Jack's, stories of loss, of struggle, of everything slipping through your fingers despite your best efforts. "I'm sorry to hear that," Andrew said softly, realizing how inadequate those words sounded. Jack shrugged again. "It is what it is. You learn to live with it. But finding a job, staying on your feet, that's a whole different battle. It didn't take long before I was out on the street, and once you're out there, it's not easy to get back up." Andrew nodded, trying to process it all. Here was a man who had fought for his country, only to be discarded when he returned. The contrast between Jack's world and his own couldn't have been starker, and for the first time in a long while, Andrew felt uncomfortable. "I can't imagine what that's like," Andrew admitted. He'd spent so long building his life, protecting his wealth, and ensuring that he stayed at the top of the ladder, that he hadn't stopped to think about the people who had been pushed off that same ladder. The waiter returned with their meals, breaking the tension for a moment. Jack looked down at the perfectly cooked steak on his plate, its scent rising like a forgotten memory. He hadn't had food like this in years, but even so, he found it hard to enjoy. The weight of the conversation, the stark contrast between him and Andrew, lingered. Andrew watched Jack carefully. There was something about this man's quiet strength, his refusal to let the world's cruelty define him, that tugged at something in Andrew's chest. This wasn't just a homeless man returning a wallet. This was a man who had lived a life, fought battles, internal and external, that Andrew couldn't begin to understand. "You ever think about going back?" Andrew asked suddenly. "To your old life?" Jack looked up from his meal, his eyes hard. "Back to what?" he asked bitterly. "My wife's remarried. I don't even know where she lives anymore. I don't have a family, no home, no job. What is there to go back to?" Andrew swallowed, feeling his throat tighten. He wasn't sure what he expected, but it wasn't this. Jack's honesty cut through the veneer of Andrew's polished life. Suddenly, his meetings, his business deals, and his social status felt hollow in comparison to what Jack had lost. "I want to help," Andrew said, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "I don't know how yet, but I can help. I run a business. Maybe there's something you could do. I don't mean charity. I mean a real job, a chance to get back on your feet." Jack's eyes narrowed in suspicion. He'd heard offers like this before, and they never panned out the way they were supposed to. But something about Andrew's tone was different. He wasn't offering pity, he was offering an opportunity. "I don't know," Jack said cautiously. "I'm not looking for handouts." "It's not a handout," Andrew insisted. "You returned my wallet without expecting anything in return. You did the right thing, and I respect that. I could use someone like you. Just think about it." Jack was silent for a long moment, weighing his options. He'd been let down too many times before to trust easily, but something about Andrew's offer seemed genuine. "Fine," Jack said at last, his voice low. "I'll think about it." Andrew smiled, feeling a sense of relief. This wasn't just about helping Jack. It was about doing something meaningful, something that went beyond his world of deals and profits. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted. Jack stood on the corner of the bustling street, staring up at the looming glass building that housed Foster Enterprises. The sunlight bounced off the sleek windows, casting sharp reflections onto the sidewalk, and for a moment, Jack felt like he was back on the battlefield. The heat, the noise, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. Except this wasn't a battlefield. This was a corporate office, worlds away from where he'd spent most of his life. Jack didn't belong here, and every fiber of his being told him to turn around and walk away. But something stopped him. Maybe it was Andrew's sincerity, or maybe it was the simple fact that Jack was tired. Tired of being invisible, tired of being stuck. He had nothing left to lose, so what was one more step into a world he didn't understand? With a deep breath, Jack squared his shoulders and walked through the revolving doors, entering a world that felt foreign yet beckoned with a strange allure. Inside, the air was cool and crisp, filled with the faint hum of conversations and the distant clatter of keyboards. The receptionist, a polished young woman who looked like she belonged on the cover of a magazine, glanced up and hesitated, her smile faltering as her eyes took in Jack's worn jacket and scuffed shoes. "I'm here to see Andrew Foster," Jack said, his voice steady despite the unease crawling up his spine. The receptionist's eyes flicked toward a computer screen. "Do you have an appointment?" Jack shifted slightly. "He's expecting me." She gave him another once-over but picked up the phone, her voice soft as she spoke into the receiver. After a moment, she nodded and gestured toward the elevator. "Mr. Foster's office is on the top floor. He's waiting for you." Jack nodded in thanks and stepped into the elevator, the doors closing behind him with a quiet swoosh. As the floors ticked by, Jack couldn't help but think about the last time he'd been in a place like this. It had been years, back when he still wore a uniform, back when the world felt a little more straightforward. Now, everything was different. The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open to reveal an expansive office space, open and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a stunning view of the city. It was the kind of place Jack had only seen in movies, the kind of place he never imagined he'd find himself in. Andrew was standing near his desk, a smile spreading across his face as soon as he saw Jack step out of the elevator. "Jack, you made it," Andrew said, walking toward him with an outstretched hand. Jack shook it, feeling slightly out of place in this polished environment. "Yeah, I wasn't sure if I would," he admitted. Andrew motioned for him to sit down in one of the sleek leather chairs in front of his desk. "I'm glad you did. I meant what I said the other day. I want to help you, and I think we can help each other." Jack nodded, still unsure of what to expect. "I've thought about your offer," he said slowly, "but I'm not looking for charity." Andrew's expression softened. "This isn't charity, Jack. I don't want you to feel that way. I need someone I can trust, someone who knows how to work hard and doesn't take shortcuts. And I see that in you." Jack glanced out the window, the city stretching out below them, endless and full of opportunities that always seemed out of his reach. "I've been through a lot," he said quietly. "I'm not sure I fit in here." Andrew leaned forward. "You don't have to fit into anyone else's mold. I'm not asking you to change who you are. I'm offering you a chance to use what you've learned, to build something new. For yourself." Jack looked at him for a long moment, searching for any signs of pity or condescension. But all he saw in Andrew's eyes was sincerity, a genuine desire to help without strings attached. It was rare, and Jack knew that opportunities like this didn't come around often. "All right," Jack said finally, his voice resolute. "I'll give it a shot." Andrew's smile widened. "Good, let's get you started." The next few days passed in a blur for Jack. Andrew had assigned him to help out in various departments, letting him get a feel for the company while subtly testing his abilities. Jack hadn't worked in an office in years, but the structure and discipline he'd learned in the military came back to him in small ways, guiding him through the unfamiliar environment. He was put to work helping with logistics, coordinating deliveries, managing inventory, and overseeing some of the more hands-on tasks that required an eye for detail. It wasn't glamorous, but Jack didn't mind. It felt good to work again, to be a part of something bigger than himself. Andrew checked in with him regularly, making sure he was adjusting. The other employees, however, were a different story. Jack could feel their eyes on him, the subtle whispers behind his back. He didn't look like the other employees, and he certainly didn't have their polished resumes. But Jack had faced worse than this, and he wasn't about to let a few judgmental looks get under his skin. One afternoon, as Jack was heading to the break room for a cup of coffee, he overheard two employees talking in hushed voices by the water cooler. "Who's the new guy?" one of them asked, a hint of disdain in his voice. "I heard he's some kind of charity case," the other replied, glancing over at Jack. "Foster brought him in from the streets. Can you believe that?" Jack stopped in his tracks, his hand tightening around the coffee cup. He'd heard things like this before, but hearing it here, in this polished office where he was trying to make a fresh start, stung in a way he hadn't expected. He could have walked away, let it slide like he always did. But something about today felt different. Maybe it was the way they talked about him like he wasn't even a person. Maybe it was the fact that he was tired of being looked down on. Whatever it was, Jack turned on his heel and approached them, his face calm but his eyes steely. "You got something to say to me?" Jack asked, his voice low but firm. The two employees froze, their smug expressions faltering as they looked at Jack. One of them, a young man with slicked-back hair and a designer suit, sneered. "Yeah, actually. We were just wondering how someone like you got a job here. You don't exactly look like the office type." Jack met his gaze without blinking. "Maybe I don't, but I do my job, and I do it well. Can you say the same?" The man's smirk faded, and for a moment he looked like he was about to say something back. But Jack didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked away, his pulse steady but his mind racing. He wasn't here to prove anything to anyone. He was here for himself. As he walked back to his desk, he spotted Andrew standing in the doorway of his office, watching the exchange. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Andrew gave Jack a small nod, a gesture of understanding, of solidarity. Jack nodded back, feeling a sense of reassurance wash over him. He had made a decision to start over, to rebuild his life, and he wasn't going to let a few narrow-minded people stand in his way. Days turned into weeks, and slowly but surely, Jack began to carve out a space for himself within Foster Enterprises. He still felt like a stranger in this polished, high-powered world, but work was work, and he threw himself into it with the same diligence that had carried him through his years in the military. The logistics department had come to respect him, even if they didn't fully understand him. Jack wasn't here to make friends, he was here to work. Andrew, true to his word, checked in with Jack frequently. He would stop by the logistics floor, always with a genuine smile and a question about how things were going. It wasn't just about the job anymore. There was a growing camaraderie between them that Andrew found himself increasingly drawn to. He didn't understand it entirely, but Jack's no-nonsense honesty, his quiet determination, was a refreshing contrast to the world of business deals and shallow connections that Andrew lived in. It was late one evening, the office mostly empty, when Andrew caught sight of Jack sitting alone in the break room. His hands were wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, his eyes distant as he stared out the window. Andrew, always quick to act on instinct, grabbed a cup for himself and walked over. "Mind if I join you?" Andrew asked, sliding into the seat across from Jack. Jack glanced up, a hint of surprise in his eyes before he gave a slight nod. "Go ahead." Andrew settled into his chair and took a sip of his coffee, the silence between them feeling oddly comfortable. After a few minutes, Andrew leaned forward, curiosity getting the better of him. "How are you finding it here?" he asked. "Is it what you expected?" Jack didn't answer right away. His eyes remained fixed on the cityscape outside, the twinkling lights of the buildings stretching out into the night. "I didn't expect much," he finally admitted. "Didn't expect to last this long either." Andrew raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" Jack's fingers drummed lightly on the table, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. "People like me, we don't usually fit in here." His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of tension. "I'm not one of your business types. I don't speak the language of deals and profits. I just work." Andrew set his cup down and leaned back, studying Jack carefully. "You work harder than most people in this building, Jack. That's why you're still here." Jack shrugged as if dismissing the compliment. "It's not just about the work, though. It's about the world I came from, and the world I left behind." Andrew frowned slightly, sensing the shift in the conversation. He had wanted to ask about Jack's past for weeks, but he never pressed, not wanting to pry where he wasn't welcome. Now it felt like Jack was on the verge of opening up, and Andrew knew better than to push too hard. "What world is that?" Andrew asked carefully. Jack let out a slow breath, his gaze finally leaving the window to meet Andrew's. "The military. That world. I spent years serving my country, watching my brothers fall, and when I came back, there was nothing for me. No place for someone like me in this city. Not after everything I'd seen." Andrew listened quietly, his eyes narrowing as he thought about how so many veterans had fallen through the cracks, left behind by the very society they had fought to protect. He didn't know the specifics of Jack's story, but he could hear the pain and frustration beneath his words. "What happened when you came back?" Andrew asked gently. Jack stared at his coffee for a long time before speaking. "I couldn't adjust. Couldn't find a job that made sense and couldn't keep the family I had." His voice was steady, but there was a rawness to it. "My wife tried to hold on, but I was too far gone. I didn't know how to be normal again, how to be part of a family. And eventually, she left." Andrew swallowed hard. He had expected to hear about Jack's hardships, but hearing about the loss of family hit closer to home than he realized. Andrew had worked his whole life to provide for his family. His wealth, his success, everything he had done was for them. But in Jack's story, he saw a different side to the sacrifices he hadn't considered. The cost of serving, of losing yourself in something bigger, only to come back to a world that had no place for you. "I'm sorry, Jack," Andrew said quietly. "I can't imagine what that's like." Jack gave him a small nod, his face a mix of acceptance and lingering regret. "It is what it is. I've had time to think about it, but the truth is I'm still trying to figure out where I fit." Andrew was quiet for a long moment, his mind racing. He had brought Jack into his company because he saw potential in him. But now he was starting to see that Jack was more than just an employee. He was a man looking for redemption, for a place to belong again. And Andrew wanted to help him find that place. "I've been thinking," Andrew said suddenly, breaking the silence. "There's something I want to offer you." Jack looked at him, his expression unreadable. "What kind of offer?" Andrew leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "I don't just want you working in logistics. I want you to be part of something bigger here. I've been talking to some people about starting a program, something to help veterans like you transition back into civilian life. A job placement program, but more than that. Offering counseling, support, helping them find their feet again." Jack's eyes widened slightly, clearly taken aback. "You want me to help with that?" Andrew nodded. "Who better? You know what it's like. You've lived through it. I think you'd be perfect for this." Jack was silent, his mind clearly working through the implications. He had spent so long trying to survive day by day that the thought of building something for others, something that could give people like him a second chance, felt overwhelming. "I don't know if I'm the right person for that," Jack said after a moment, his voice hesitant. "I'm still figuring things out myself." Andrew smiled slightly. That's exactly why you're the right person. You know what they're going through, and you're already finding your way. You've got more strength than you realize, Jack. Jack's hands tightened around his cup as he considered Andrew's words. Part of him wanted to refuse, to walk away from the weight of such a responsibility. But another part of him, the part that had led men into battle, the part that still wanted to make a difference, was drawn to the idea. You really think I can do this? Jack asked, his voice quiet but serious. Andrew nodded, his gaze steady. I know you can. Jack sat back in his chair, the weight of Andrew's offer settling over him. He had been drifting for so long, unsure of where he belonged, but now, for the first time in years, he could see a glimmer of purpose on the horizon, a chance to help others who had been through the same hell he had. I'll think about it, Jack said finally, his voice firm but thoughtful. I'll give it some real thought. Andrew smiled, knowing that Jack's words were as close to a yes as he would get for now. That's all I ask. The two men sat in silence for a few moments longer, the weight of the conversation hanging between them. But beneath that weight, there was something new, a sense of possibility, of something greater than either of them had anticipated. The days that followed Andrew's offer weighed heavily on Jack's mind. He spent his nights lying awake in the small room he had rented with the money he earned, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts a tangled web of uncertainty. The idea of taking on a leadership role, of being the one to guide others through the struggles he had barely survived himself, felt too overwhelming. Jack had always seen himself as a survivor, not a leader. Could he really be the person Andrew thought he was? But deep down, Jack knew the answer wasn't just about him. Andrew's offer was more than just a job. It was a lifeline, not just for him, but for others like him, those who had been lost in the system, forgotten after their service. And that thought haunted him. How many more men and women were out there struggling the way he had? Could he really walk away from an opportunity to help them? The next morning, Jack found himself standing outside Andrew's office, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He hadn't made a final decision, but he knew he couldn't keep avoiding Andrew's offer forever. He needed to face it. Andrew was sitting at his desk when Jack knocked on the door. He looked up, a welcoming smile crossing his face. Jack, come in. Jack stepped inside, feeling the weight of the room settle over him. It was the same sleek, modern office where their journey together had begun. But today, it felt different, more real, more important. Andrew gestured to the chair in front of his desk. Have a seat. Jack sat down, his posture tense, his eyes briefly scanning the papers and plans strewn across Andrew's desk. He knew what they were about, the veterans program Andrew had mentioned. It was still in the early stages, but Andrew had thrown himself into the project with a kind of energy that surprised Jack. It was clear that this wasn't just a passing idea for Andrew, it was something he was committed to. I've been thinking about your offer, Jack began, his voice steady but low. Andrew leaned forward, his attention focused completely on Jack. And? Jack let out a long breath, gathering his thoughts. I don't know if I'm the right person for this, Andrew. I've never led anything like this before. I've been through hell, sure, but I'm still figuring things out myself. What if I mess it up? What if I let you down? Andrew shook his head. Jack, I'm not worried about that. I've seen what you can do, how hard you work, how much you care about people. You've got the experience, the heart, and most importantly, the understanding of what these veterans are going through. That's what matters. Jack stared at his hands, his mind still reeling. He had spent so long scraping by, just trying to survive from one day to the next, that the idea of stepping into something bigger felt almost impossible. He wasn't used to thinking about the future, but now, for the first time in years, there was a future worth thinking about. You really think I can do this? Jack asked, his voice quieter now, as if he were asking himself as much as he was asking Andrew. I know you can, Andrew said firmly, and you won't be doing it alone. I'll be with you every step of the way. We'll build this together, Jack met Andrew's eyes, seeing the determination there. Andrew believed in him, even when Jack couldn't quite believe in himself. And maybe that was enough, for now. "I'll do it," Jack said at last, his voice steady. "I'll take the job." Andrew's smile was wide and genuine. "You won't regret it, Jack. We're going to make a real difference." The weeks that followed Jack's decision were some of the busiest of his life. Andrew had wasted no time getting the ball rolling on the Veterans Program, and Jack found himself thrown into a whirlwind of meetings, strategy sessions, and planning. It was all new to him: the corporate speak, the endless paperwork, the feeling of being part of something larger than just getting through the day. Despite the unfamiliar territory, Jack quickly found his footing. He leaned on his military background, his ability to organize, to plan, to keep people focused in the midst of chaos. The Veterans Program began to take shape, its mission clear: to provide veterans with the tools and support they needed to transition back into civilian life, whether through job training, counseling, or financial guidance. But not everyone in the company was as enthusiastic as Andrew. One afternoon, Jack was heading to a meeting when he overheard a conversation in one of the glass-walled offices. Two senior executives, both of whom Jack had seen around but never spoken to, were deep in discussion. They didn't seem to notice Jack passing by, or maybe they didn't care. "I don't get why Andrew's wasting time on this veterans thing," one of the men was saying, his tone dismissive. "It's not going to bring in any money. It's just a feel-good project." "Yeah," the other replied with a snort. "I don't know what Andrew sees in that guy. He's just some charity case. There are plenty of real professionals who could do a better job." Jack stopped in his tracks, his chest tightening. He hadn't realized how much his presence in the company was resented, how much some of the higher-ups saw him as nothing more than a burden, a project. The words stung, but more than that, they filled him with doubt. Was this what people thought of him? That he was only here because of Andrew's pity? Did they really believe he wasn't capable of doing the job? For a moment, Jack wanted to turn around, walk out, and never come back. He didn't need this, didn't need to fight a battle for people who didn't believe in him. But then he thought of the veterans the program was meant to help. He thought of the men and women who had been left behind, just like he had been. If he walked away now, he'd be walking away from them, too. Jack straightened his back and kept walking. He wasn't here for the approval of a few executives. He was here because Andrew believed in him, and because he believed in the mission. That was enough. Jack entered the meeting room, where Andrew and several department heads were already gathered. There was a large whiteboard on one side of the room, covered in notes and diagrams about the Veterans Program. It was clear that this project was more than just an afterthought to Andrew. It was becoming a core part of the company's identity. "Jack, glad you're here," Andrew said as Jack took a seat at the table. "We're just going over some of the final details before we launch the program next month." Jack nodded, though his mind was still buzzing with the conversation he had overheard earlier. He tried to push it aside, focusing on the task at hand. Andrew was outlining the next steps: partnerships with local veteran organizations, a job fair specifically for veterans, and a mentorship program where former service members could connect with business professionals. It was all coming together, and Jack could see the excitement in the room, at least from most of the team. There were still a few faces, the same ones from the conversation earlier, that looked less than thrilled. But Jack forced himself to focus on those who supported the program. When the meeting ended, Andrew pulled Jack aside. "How are you feeling about everything?" he asked, his tone filled with genuine concern. "I know this is a lot, and I just want to make sure you're good." Jack hesitated for a moment, wondering if he should mention what he had overheard, but he decided against it. He didn't want to bring Andrew into it. Not yet. "I'm good," Jack said, offering a small smile. "It's a lot to take in, but I'm ready. We've got a lot of work to do." Andrew clapped him on the back. "That's the spirit. I knew you were the right person for this." Jack nodded, though his mind was still heavy with doubt. He had come a long way from where he had been, but the road ahead was still uncertain. There would be challenges. He knew that. But for now, he had to focus on the mission. The veterans depended on him, and Jack wasn't about to let them down. The program was picking up momentum. Jack had spent hours planning, meeting with veteran organizations, and getting everything in place for the launch. Every day, the mission became clearer, and he found himself immersed in work that felt meaningful. But there was still resistance, quiet but palpable, from parts of the company. The whispers, the cold glances, and the feeling that some people saw him as a charity project never truly went away. One afternoon, Jack was called into an executive meeting. As he entered the sleek, glass-walled conference room, he saw several of the senior executives who had been less than supportive of the Veterans Program seated around the table. Andrew was there too, his usual calm confidence radiating from him. "Jack, good to see you," Andrew said with a smile, motioning to an empty seat next to him. Jack nodded and took his place, feeling the weight of the eyes on him. He had faced far worse in his life, but the scrutiny from these polished businessmen still gnawed at him. He wasn't one of them, and he never would be. But he wasn't here to be one of them. He was here to make a difference. "We've gathered today to review the progress of the Veterans Program," one of the executives, Mr. Harris, said in a clipped tone, glancing at his notes. His expression was neutral, but Jack could sense the underlying skepticism in his voice. "Before we proceed with the full launch, we want to ensure that the program is aligned with the company's goals and that it will generate a return on investment." Jack felt his jaw tighten. He had known from the start that there would be pushback. To some people, this program was nothing more than a line item, an expense. But to Jack and to Andrew, it was something far more important than profits. Andrew leaned forward, cutting through the tension with a smile. "I understand the concern about ROI, but this program isn't just about direct financial returns. It's about building a stronger connection with our community, supporting veterans who have sacrificed so much, and enhancing our company's reputation for social responsibility. Long term, the benefits are immeasurable." Mr. Harris raised an eyebrow. "I don't disagree with that, but we need to be realistic. We've invested a significant amount into this initiative, and we need to see measurable results. How are we quantifying success?" Jack took a deep breath. This was his chance to speak up. He had been preparing for this moment, knowing that some of the executives wouldn't be satisfied with goodwill alone. "We've set up clear metrics for the program," Jack began, his voice steady but firm. "We're tracking job placements, training completion rates, and the number of veterans who receive financial counseling. We're also partnering with other organizations to expand our reach and impact. The results will take time, but the groundwork we're laying is solid." One of the other executives, Ms. Caldwell, nodded approvingly. "That's good to hear, but how are we positioning ourselves in the market? Social responsibility is important, but we can't ignore the competitive advantage we need to maintain." Jack glanced at Andrew, who gave him a slight nod of encouragement. "By focusing on veterans, we're tapping into a demographic that's often overlooked," Jack explained. "These men and women have incredible skills, discipline, leadership, problem-solving, that are invaluable in the workplace. By helping them transition, we're also bringing those skills into our company and our partner companies. It's not just about doing the right thing. It's about making smart business decisions that benefit everyone." There was a moment of silence as the executives considered Jack's words. Harris, however, remained unconvinced. "I understand the intent," he said, his tone still skeptical, "but we need to be careful not to overextend ourselves. This program can't be a distraction from our core business." Andrew's expression hardened slightly, though his tone remained calm. "I don't see this as a distraction, Mr. Harris. In fact, I see it as an extension of who we are as a company. We're not just here to make profits, we're here to make a difference. And I believe that's what will set us apart from the competition." Jack could feel the tension in the room, the subtle tug-of-war between those who saw the value of the program and those who were focused solely on the bottom line. He had known it would be like this, but standing here, facing their skepticism head-on, made it more real. Mr. Harris cleared his throat. "Well, we'll see how things progress. I think it's important to keep monitoring the situation closely." Andrew nodded, though his gaze didn't waver. "We'll continue tracking the progress and adjusting as needed, but I have full confidence in Jack's leadership of this program." The meeting wrapped up shortly after that, but the weight of the unspoken doubts lingered in the air as the executives filed out of the room. Jack remained seated for a moment, his thoughts heavy. It didn't matter how much progress they made. There would always be people who doubted him, people who saw him as someone who didn't belong. Andrew stayed behind as well, watching the others leave before turning to Jack. "Don't let them get to you," he said quietly. "They're just thinking in numbers. They don't see what we see." Jack gave a small nod, though the doubts still gnawed at him. "I just don't want to let you down." "You won't," Andrew said firmly. "I believe in this program, and I believe in you. It's not going to be easy, but nothing worth doing ever is." Jack stood, feeling a surge of determination rise within him. "I'll make it work," he said, his voice steadier now. "I owe it to the people this program is for." The meeting had shaken Jack, but it had also solidified his resolve. He knew what he was up against, and he knew the stakes were high, not just for the program, but for himself. He couldn't fail. Not now. A few days later, Jack was sitting at his desk going over the latest updates on the Veterans Program when his phone rang. It wasn't a number he recognized, but something in his gut told him to answer. "Jack speaking," he said, his voice even. "Jack O'Connor," the voice on the other end asked, rough and familiar. Jack froze. He hadn't heard that voice in years. "Yeah, this is Jack," he replied slowly, his heart racing. "It's Mark. Mark Reynolds." Jack's breath caught in his throat. Mark Reynolds had been in Jack's unit during his time in the military. They had served together, fought together, and survived things that no one else could understand. But they hadn't spoken in years, not since Jack had left everything behind and disappeared into the shadows of civilian life. "Mark?" Jack said, his voice tight. "It's been a long time." "Yeah," Mark replied, the weight of the past heavy in his tone. "I heard you were working on something for veterans. Thought I'd reach out." Jack leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He hadn't expected to hear from anyone from his old life, let alone Mark. "How'd you hear about that?" "Word gets around," Mark said with a chuckle. "I've been keeping tabs on you. Didn't think you'd end up working for some big-shot business guy, though." Jack felt a mix of emotions, surprise, unease, and a strange sense of connection to the past he had tried to leave behind. Things change. "Yeah, they do," Mark agreed. "Listen, I've been thinking. Maybe I could help. I know some guys who could use what you're offering. A lot of them are still struggling, same as we were. They need someone to give them a chance." Jack's heart softened at the mention of the men they had served with. He knew the pain, the struggle, and the desperation that so many of them still felt. If there was anyone who understood what this program could do, it was Mark. "I'd appreciate that," Jack said. "We're still getting everything off the ground, but I'd love to have you involved." Mark was quiet for a moment before he spoke again. "You know, I always figured you'd disappear for good after everything. Glad to see I was wrong." Jack's throat tightened. The memories of their service together were still sharp, still painful. But hearing Mark's voice, knowing that there were still people out there who remembered him, who understood what he had been through, brought a sense of comfort he hadn't expected. "Yeah," Jack said softly. "I'm still here." Jack had always known that the past had a way of catching up with you, no matter how fast or far you ran. Mark Reynolds' call had stirred something deep within him, a mixture of guilt, nostalgia, and a long-buried sense of duty. He hadn't expected to hear from anyone from his old unit, let alone Mark, who had been one of the few men Jack truly trusted during his time in the military. The next morning, as Jack walked into Foster Enterprises, his mind was still reeling from the conversation. He knew Mark's intentions were good. The veterans they had served with were still struggling, many of them far worse than Jack had been. If Mark wanted to help, Jack couldn't refuse. But with Mark's return came a flood of memories, many of them painful. There were things they had seen, decisions they had made, and parts of Jack's past that he had tried so hard to bury. Jack shook the thoughts away as he stepped into the office. Today was the day they would finalize the Veterans Program launch, and there was no room for distraction. He had to stay focused. The success of the program, of the veterans who needed it, depended on it. As Jack walked through the office, he noticed more eyes on him than usual. The whispers had grown quieter, but they were still there, lurking just beneath the surface. He had made progress, yes, but he was still the outsider to many of the employees, and that wasn't going to change overnight. When Jack reached his desk, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Andrew. "Meeting in 15. Let's finalize this program." Jack smiled, appreciating Andrew's enthusiasm. If there was one thing Jack could count on, it was Andrew's unwavering support. Despite the resistance from some of the executives, Andrew had pushed the Veterans Program forward with a determination that surprised even Jack. This was more than just a business initiative for Andrew. It was personal, and that meant something to Jack. The conference room was filled with the familiar faces of the department heads and executives. Jack noticed Mr. Harris and Ms. Caldwell seated near the head of the table, their expressions unreadable. Andrew sat at the front, as always, calm but focused. As Jack took his seat, Andrew glanced at him and gave a small nod. "Glad you could make it, Jack. Let's get started." Andrew stood and walked to the front of the room, gesturing to the whiteboard behind him, which was filled with charts and projections related to the Veterans Program. "We're here today to finalize the last details of the Veterans Transition Program. As you all know, this initiative is important not only for our company's social responsibility efforts but also for the long-term value it brings by tapping into an often overlooked talent pool." Jack listened closely as Andrew went over the key points of the program: partnerships with local organizations, job training initiatives, and a mentorship system for veterans transitioning into civilian work. It was all coming together. Andrew then gestured to Jack. "Jack has been instrumental in shaping this program. His experience and insight have made it what it is today. I'll let him share some of the final touches we've made before we move forward." Jack stood, feeling the weight of the room's attention settle on him. He had never been the type to seek the spotlight, but here he was, leading a program that could change lives. He cleared his throat and began. "We've finalized partnerships with 3 local veteran organizations," Jack started, his voice steady. "These organizations will help us identify veterans who are struggling with the transition back into civilian life. From there, we'll offer job training, resume workshops, and financial counseling. Our goal isn't just to place veterans in jobs, it's to give them the tools they need to succeed in the long term." The room was quiet as Jack continued, detailing the mentorship aspect of the program and how they would measure success. He kept his tone confident, even though he could feel the lingering doubt from some of the executives. When he finished, Andrew took over again. "We've done a lot of work to get here, but there's still more to be done. We're set to launch next month, but I wanted to open the floor for any final thoughts or concerns before we move forward." There was a moment of silence. Then Mr. Harris spoke up, his voice measured. "I think the program is well-intentioned, but I'm still concerned about the long-term sustainability. What happens if we don't see the results we're expecting?" Andrew's gaze hardened slightly, though he kept his tone diplomatic. "We have clear metrics in place and will adjust as needed, but I'm confident this program will bring value, not just to the veterans, but to our company." Ms. Caldwell chimed in, her tone less confrontational than Harris's. "I think it's a strong program. My only question is about scalability. If this succeeds, how do we expand it to reach more veterans? We don't want to limit ourselves to a handful of partnerships." Jack nodded, grateful for the question. We've already had preliminary talks with national organizations. If we succeed locally, we'll be able to expand the program on a larger scale, working with more companies and more veterans across the country." The room seemed to relax a little, and Jack could feel the tide turning in their favor. The program wasn't perfect, but it was strong, and it was needed. Andrew wrapped up the meeting, confident and decisive. "Let's move forward with the launch next month. Jack, you've done an incredible job pulling this together. I have no doubt it's going to be a success." As the meeting adjourned, Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him. They were moving forward. The doubts were still there, but the momentum was undeniable. Later that afternoon, as Jack was reviewing some final documents for the program, his phone buzzed again. It was Mark. "I'm in town. Got some time to meet?" Jack hesitated. He hadn't expected Mark to show up so soon, and part of him wasn't sure if he was ready for that face-to-face conversation. But he couldn't avoid the past forever. Mark had been a brother to him once, and now he was offering to help. "Yeah," Jack texted back. "Meet me at O'Donnell's pub in an hour." O'Donnell's was a quiet, unassuming place on the edge of the city, a far cry from the upscale spots Andrew frequented, but Jack preferred its simplicity. It was the kind of place where you could sit with a drink and not be bothered by anyone. When Jack arrived, Mark was already there, sitting in a booth near the back. He looked older, more worn than Jack remembered, but there was still a spark of the old Mark in his eyes. "Jack," Mark said, standing to greet him with a firm handshake. "Good to see you, brother." "You too," Jack replied, sliding into the booth across from him. "Been a while." Mark nodded, his gaze sharp as he studied Jack. "Yeah, didn't expect to find you working for some big company, putting together a program like this." Jack shrugged, leaning back in his seat. "Life takes you places you don't expect." They ordered drinks, and for a moment the conversation drifted to safer topics. Life since the military, the challenges they had both faced, the things they had lost. But Jack could sense that there was something else on Mark's mind, something he hadn't said yet. "What's really going on, Mark?" Jack asked, cutting through the small talk. "Why'd you reach out now?" Mark took a long sip of his drink, then set the glass down carefully. "Because, Jack, some of the guys we served with, they're in trouble. And I'm not just talking about struggling to find work. There's some bad stuff going on. I didn't want to drag you into it, but you need to know." Jack's heart tightened, his mind racing. He had thought that part of his life was behind him, that the battles he had fought were over. But as he looked at Mark, he realized that the past was still very much alive, and it was about to come crashing into his present. "What kind of trouble?" Jack asked, his voice low. Mark leaned in closer, his expression grim. "The kind that's going to change everything if we don't do something about it." Jack sat back in the booth at O'Donnell's pub, his mind racing. Mark's words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken dangers. He hadn't seen it coming, this sudden reappearance of the past. Jack had spent years trying to bury it, but now it was here, clawing its way back to the surface. Mark took another sip of his drink and leaned forward, his voice low. "There's a group, some of the guys from our unit. After everything we went through, they couldn't adjust when they got back. It got bad, Jack. Real bad. They're tangled up in some dangerous stuff. Drug running, debts, you name it. It's ugly." Jack clenched his fists under the table. This wasn't just a story about struggling veterans. This was a crisis, one that could ruin lives if it hadn't already. He thought about the men in his unit, the ones he had fought beside, the ones who had come home to a country that didn't seem to care about them anymore. He knew how hard the adjustment had been. But this was more than he had imagined. "How bad is it?" Jack asked, his voice tight with concern. Mark's face was grim. "One of them, Sam Walker, he's in deep. He's been running with a bad crowd. Drugs, money laundering, the works. He's not the only one, but he's the one I'm worried about. The guy we knew? He's not there anymore. He's desperate, and when people get desperate, they do stupid things. Dangerous things." Jack sat in silence for a moment, letting the weight of Mark's words sink in. Sam Walker had been a good soldier, a loyal man who had saved lives on the battlefield. Jack could still picture his face, the way Sam had always been the first to volunteer for the hard jobs, the dangerous missions. And now he was wrapped up in something Jack didn't even want to think about. "Why are you telling me this, Mark?" Jack finally asked, his voice quieter now. Mark sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Because I don't know who else to turn to. These guys, they trust you. They looked up to you when we were overseas. Maybe you can talk some sense into them before it's too late." Jack swallowed hard. He had spent so long trying to distance himself from that life, from the pain and the memories, which the idea of diving back into it felt like opening a wound that had never truly healed. But how could he walk away from this? These were his brothers in arms, men who had been through hell with him. They deserved better than this. "I'll see what I can do," Jack said, though the uncertainty in his voice was clear. "But I'm not sure they'll listen to me. Not after all this time." Mark's gaze was steady. "They will. Trust me. They just need to know someone still cares." Jack nodded slowly, his mind already racing through the possibilities. He couldn't let these men fall deeper into the darkness, not when there was still a chance to pull them out. But at the same time, he couldn't ignore the responsibilities he had taken on with the Veterans Program. If he wasn't careful, this could spiral out of control, both for him and for the men he was trying to help. The next day, Jack found himself standing outside Foster Enterprises, his mind still replaying the conversation with Mark. He had told Andrew about the call, though he had left out the details of just how serious things were. Andrew, as always, had been supportive, encouraging Jack to take the time he needed to deal with whatever was going on. But Jack knew it wasn't that simple. As he entered the building, the familiar buzz of the office greeted him. Everything seemed normal, people going about their work, preparing for the Veterans Program launch. But Jack's mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about Sam and the others. How had things gotten so bad? How had they slipped so far without anyone stepping in? Jack sat down at his desk and pulled up the latest reports on the program. He tried to focus, but his thoughts kept drifting back to his unit, to the brothers he had left behind. He knew what it felt like to be abandoned by the system, to be left to fend for yourself when the battle was over. And now, those same men were drowning, and Jack wasn't sure if he could save them. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Andrew. "Can you come to my office? Need to discuss final launch details." Jack sighed, standing up and grabbing his notebook. He needed to focus. The Veterans Program was important. He had worked too hard to let his personal issues derail it. He headed down the hall and knocked on Andrew's office door. "Come in," Andrew called from the other side. Jack entered the office, greeted by the sight of Andrew reviewing several charts and spreadsheets. He looked up with a smile. "Jack, have a seat. We're almost ready for the launch, but I want to go over a few things with you." Jack sat down, trying to push the thoughts of Mark and Sam to the back of his mind. Andrew went over the final logistics of the program, the partnerships with local organizations, the job placement plans, and the media coverage they were arranging for the launch. It was all coming together. But Jack felt a knot tightening in his stomach. His mind kept drifting back to the men he had served with, to the lives that were unraveling as he sat in this office, discussing job placements and media strategies. "You okay?" Andrew asked, his voice breaking through Jack's thoughts. Jack blinked, realizing that he hadn't been paying attention. "Yeah," he said quickly. "Sorry, just got a lot on my mind." Andrew leaned back in his chair, studying Jack closely. "Something's been bothering you since yesterday. What's going on?" Jack hesitated. He had always kept his personal life and his work separate. But with Andrew, things were different. Andrew had become more than just a boss. He was a friend, someone who had given Jack a second chance when no one else would. If anyone deserved the truth, it was Andrew. "Remember that call I told you about?" Jack said, his voice low. It was from a guy I served with. Mark Reynolds. Some of the guys from my unit. They're in trouble. Real trouble. Drugs, debts, everything. They're spiraling out of control, and Mark thinks I might be able to help them." Andrew's expression shifted, concern flashing in his eyes. "That's serious." Jack nodded. "Yeah, it is, and I want to help them, but I don't know how. I've got this program to run, and if I get involved with them, it could complicate things. I don't want to mess up everything we've built here." Andrew was silent for a moment, clearly thinking. "Look, Jack, you've done an incredible job with the Veterans Program, but I understand that this is personal for you. If you need to take some time to help them, do it. The program will be fine. You've laid the groundwork, and we've got a solid team behind it. We can handle things while you figure this out." Jack felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Andrew's support had been unwavering from the beginning, and now, even in the face of a personal crisis, he was willing to give Jack the space he needed. "I appreciate that," Jack said, his voice sincere, "but I don't want to let anyone down. This program means everything to me." Andrew leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You won't let anyone down, Jack. You've already done more than anyone expected, and if helping these men from your unit is what you need to do, then that's what you should focus on. We'll keep things moving here. You can count on us." Jack nodded, feeling a sense of relief, though the weight of the situation still pressed heavily on his shoulders. He wasn't sure how he was going to help Sam and the others, but he knew he couldn't walk away from them, not when they were this close to losing everything. "I'll make a few calls," Jack said, standing up. "See if I can track down Sam and figure out what's really going on." Andrew stood as well, offering Jack a firm handshake. "Whatever you need, we're here. Just let me know how I can help." Jack smiled, though it was tinged with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. "Thanks, Andrew. I'll keep you posted." As Jack left Andrew's office, the weight of the decision he had to make pressed down on him. He was being pulled in two directions: the life he had built here with the Veterans Program, and the life he had left behind, the one that was now calling him back. And Jack knew that whichever path he chose, there would be no turning back. Jack spent the next few days reaching out to old contacts, pulling together threads that had long since unraveled. He hadn't realized how disconnected he had become from the men he had once called brothers, how the bonds forged in war had frayed in the years since. But now, he had no choice but to confront the past head-on. Mark had been right. Sam Walker and the others were in deep. Jack's stomach churned as he pieced together the details. It wasn't just drugs and debts. It was worse. Some of the men were involved with criminal syndicates, pulled in by desperation and false promises. Sam, once the most reliable guy in their unit, was now caught in a web of dangerous deals, and from what Mark had told him, Sam was teetering on the edge of something catastrophic. Jack knew he had to find Sam, but he had no idea where to start. It wasn't like Sam would just answer a call from an old friend, not after how far he'd fallen. Jack needed help, and there was only one person he could think of to turn to. He grabbed his phone and called Mark. "Hey, Mark," Jack said when his friend picked up. "I need to find Sam. Do you have any idea where he might be?" Mark's voice was heavy with concern. "He's been laying low. There's a place he goes to when things get bad, a dive bar on the outskirts of town. I can meet you there if you want." Jack agreed. They arranged to meet that evening. As Jack hung up the phone, he felt a familiar tension settle into his chest. The same feeling he had before stepping into a mission, that gnawing sense of uncertainty mixed with purpose. But this time, the stakes felt different. The battlefield had changed, but the danger was still very real. The sun was setting as Jack pulled up outside the dingy bar that Mark had mentioned. It was the kind of place where people went to disappear, a small, worn-down building on the edge of town, far from the polished streets of the city center. Jack sat in his truck for a moment, staring at the flickering neon sign that read, "The Rusty Nail." Mark's car was already there, parked in the back. Jack spotted him leaning against the hood, arms crossed, eyes scanning the entrance. Jack climbed out of his truck and made his way over, his footsteps slow and deliberate. "Any sign of him?" Jack asked, stopping next to Mark. Mark shook his head. "Not yet. But if he's still around, this is where he'll be. It's his usual haunt when things go south." Jack nodded, feeling a knot of unease twist in his gut. He hadn't seen Sam in years, and the idea of finding him here, in a place like this, felt wrong. This wasn't the Sam he remembered, the man who had led their unit with confidence and integrity. But war changed people, and Jack knew that better than anyone. They entered the bar together, the stale air hitting Jack like a punch to the gut. It was dark inside, the dim lighting casting long shadows across the scarred wooden tables and cracked leather booths. The place reeked of alcohol and regret, the quiet murmur of conversation blending with the clink of glasses and the scratchy hum of a jukebox in the corner. Mark scanned the room, his eyes narrowing as he searched for any sign of Sam. Jack followed suit, his gaze sweeping over the scattered patrons slouched in their seats. After a few moments, Jack spotted a familiar figure hunched over at the far end of the bar. It was Sam. Jack's breath caught in his throat. Sam looked worse than he had imagined. His once broad, strong shoulders were slumped, his clothes disheveled, and his face worn with exhaustion. He was nursing a drink, staring blankly at the bar in front of him, oblivious to the world around him. Mark leaned in toward Jack. "That's him," he said softly, though there was no need to confirm it. Jack took a deep breath and made his way over to the bar. His footsteps felt heavy, the weight of their shared past pressing down on him with every step. When he reached Sam, he hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to start. "What did you say to someone you hadn't seen in years? Someone whose life had unraveled so completely?" "Sam," Jack said quietly, his voice barely audible over the noise of the bar. Sam didn't react at first, his eyes still fixed on the glass in front of him. Jack tried again, this time louder. "Sam, it's me, Jack." This time, Sam stirred. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes dull and bloodshot. For a moment, he didn't seem to recognize Jack, but then something shifted in his expression. A flicker of recognition. "Jack!" Sam's voice was rough, slurred from the alcohol. He blinked as if trying to focus. "What the hell are you doing here?" Jack sat down on the stool next to him, his gaze steady. "I'm here because I heard you're in trouble. I wanted to help." Sam let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Help? There's no help for me, man. I'm done." Jack's chest tightened. He had seen this before. The way a man could give up, lose himself to the darkness that clawed at him from all sides. But he wasn't ready to give up on Sam. Not yet. "That's not true," Jack said, keeping his voice calm but firm. "You're not done, Sam. We've been through worse, and we made it out. You can still get out of this." Sam turned to face Jack fully, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know what I've done, Jack. You don't know how far I've fallen." "I know enough," Jack replied. "Mark told me what's going on. I know you're in deep with some bad people, but it's not too late. We can figure this out. Together." Sam shook his head, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. "It's too late for me. You should have stayed out of this, Jack." Mark approached then, standing behind Jack, his voice quiet but resolute. "We're not leaving you here, Sam. You're coming with us." Sam's gaze flicked between Jack and Mark, the conflict clear in his eyes. For a moment, Jack thought he might agree, thought they might be able to pull him out of this mess before it got any worse. But then, something shifted in Sam's expression. He set his jaw and pushed himself off the stool, swaying slightly as he stood. "I can't," Sam muttered, stepping away from the bar. "You don't get it. I'm in too deep." Jack stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. "Sam, don't walk away. You don't have to do this alone." But Sam was already backing away, shaking his head. "I'm sorry, Jack. It's too late." Before Jack could say anything more, Sam turned and stumbled toward the door, disappearing into the night. Jack stood there for a moment, the weight of Sam's words sinking in. Mark stepped up beside him, his face tight with frustration. "He's not going to make it, Jack," Mark said quietly. "Not if he keeps going like this." Jack clenched his fists, anger bubbling up inside him. He had come here to help, to pull Sam out of the darkness, but Sam had pushed him away. And now, all Jack could do was watch as another brother fell deeper into the abyss. "We have to find him again," Jack said, his voice low but determined. "I'm not giving up on him." Mark nodded, though there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "We'll figure something out. But we need to be careful. The people Sam's involved with, they're not the kind you want to mess with." Jack turned to face Mark, his jaw set. "I don't care who they are. I'm not letting Sam go down without a fight." Mark met Jack's gaze, seeing the resolve there. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "We'll do this together. But it's not going to be easy." Jack nodded, his mind already racing with plans. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let Sam slip away. Not again. The night was thick with tension as Jack drove away from the Rusty Nail. The encounter with Sam had left him rattled, but more than that, it had ignited a fire inside him. He couldn't shake the image of Sam's hollowed-out face, his once bright eyes now dulled by the weight of whatever darkness had consumed him. Jack had seen men fall apart before, on and off the battlefield, but seeing it happen to Sam, to one of his own, made it feel personal in a way he hadn't expected. Mark sat in the passenger seat staring out the window, his jaw clenched. Neither of them had spoken since leaving the bar, the silence between them filled with the unspoken fears of what lay ahead. Jack had told himself he was ready to face whatever this was, but now, with the full weight of it pressing down on him, he wasn't so sure. "What do we do now?" Jack finally asked, breaking the silence as they drove down the empty road. Mark turned to him, his face grim. "We find out who Sam's running with. It's not going to be easy. These guys, they don't just let people walk away." Jack nodded, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Then we make sure Sam has a way out. I'm not letting him drown in this." Mark sighed, leaning back in his seat. "I don't know, Jack. I've seen what these guys can do. Sam's in deep, and pulling him out isn't going to be as simple as convincing him to come home. He owes these people money, favors. They own him now." The words sent a chill down Jack's spine, but he refused to give in to the doubt. He had to believe there was a way out for Sam, a way to bring him back before it was too late. He had seen men climb out of deeper pits, but Mark was right about one thing. This wasn't going to be easy. "We'll need more information," Jack said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty gnawing at him. "You said you've been keeping tabs on Sam. Do you know who he's dealing with?" Mark nodded slowly. "There's a guy. He goes by the name of Braddock. He's been running operations in this area for years. Drugs, smuggling, extortion. You name it, he's into it. I'm guessing Sam got wrapped up with him after things went south. Braddock's not the kind of guy who just lets people walk away once they're in." Jack's stomach churned. He had heard the name before, whispered among the more unsavory circles in town. Braddock was bad news, the kind of man you didn't cross if you valued your life. But if Sam was tangled up with him, Jack had no choice. "Do you know where we can find him?" Jack asked. Mark shook his head. "Not exactly. Braddock keeps a low profile, but he's got people everywhere. I've heard rumors he operates out of an old warehouse by the docks, but it's not like you can just walk up and knock on the door. We'll have to be smart about this." Jack gritted his teeth. "Then we'll start there. Tomorrow night." Mark gave him a sideways glance, skepticism written all over his face. "You sure about this, Jack? Braddock's not going to be happy if we start sniffing around his operation. This could get messy fast." Jack's expression hardened. "I'm not walking away from Sam. Not this time." Mark nodded, though Jack could see the doubt lingering in his eyes. "All right, we'll check out the warehouse tomorrow, see if we can find anything. But Jack, we need to be careful. These guys don't play by the same rules we're used to." Jack didn't need the reminder. He knew what they were up against. But he also knew that he couldn't leave Sam to rot in the mess he had fallen into. No matter what it took, he was going to pull him out. The next morning, Jack was back at Foster Enterprises, trying to focus on the final stages of the Veterans Program launch. But his mind kept drifting back to Sam and the looming confrontation with Braddock. He knew he couldn't afford to lose focus. Too much was riding on the success of the program. Andrew was counting on him. The veterans were counting on him. But the weight of his personal mission was becoming impossible to ignore. Jack sat in his office going over the latest reports when Andrew knocked on the door. "Got a minute?" he asked, stepping inside before Jack could answer. "Yeah, sure," Jack replied, motioning for Andrew to sit. Andrew took a seat, his expression more serious than usual. "I wanted to check in with you. You seemed distracted yesterday, and I get the feeling there's more going on than you're letting on." Jack leaned back in his chair, rubbing his hands over his face. He had tried to keep his personal life separate from his work, but it was becoming harder to do that. Andrew had been nothing but supportive, but Jack knew that what he was about to do, getting involved with someone like Braddock, could complicate everything. "I've got a lot on my plate right now," Jack admitted. "The guys from my unit, it's bad, Andrew. One of them, Sam, he's in with some dangerous people and I'm trying to figure out how to help him. But it's getting messy." Andrew's brow furrowed. "Dangerous how?" Jack sighed. "He's in deep with a guy named Braddock. I don't know all the details yet, but from what I've heard, Braddock runs a lot of illegal operations around here. Drugs, extortion, the works. Sam owes him, and I think it's about to come crashing down." Andrew leaned forward, his voice lowered. "Jack, you need to be careful. I know you want to help your friend, but this guy Braddock, I've heard of him. He's not someone you want to go up against." Jack met Andrew's gaze, his resolve clear. "I know, but I don't have a choice. Sam's my brother. I can't leave him in this." Andrew sat back, his expression thoughtful. "All right, just don't let this take you down with it. The program needs you, Jack. I need you. I don't want to see you throw everything away." Jack nodded, appreciating Andrew's concern. "I won't. I've come too far to let this take me down. But I have to see this through." Andrew stood, offering Jack a firm handshake. "Whatever happens, I've got your back. Just be smart about it." As Andrew left the office, Jack sat in silence, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The Veterans Program was so close to launching, but now it felt like it was slipping through his fingers. He couldn't shake the feeling that the two worlds, his personal mission and his work at Foster Enterprises, were about to collide in a way that would leave him with no easy choices. That evening, Jack and Mark met near the docks, the air cool and heavy with the scent of salt water and rust. The warehouse loomed ahead, a massive, crumbling structure that had seen better days. It was the kind of place people went when they didn't want to be found, and it sent a shiver down Jack's spine. Mark pulled up next to Jack's truck, stepping out with a nod of silent acknowledgement. Neither of them spoke as they made their way toward the warehouse, keeping to the shadows. Jack's pulse quickened as they approached, the tension mounting with each step. This was it, the first real move toward finding Sam and getting him out. "Braddock's people will be watching," Mark whispered as they crouched behind a stack of crates near the warehouse entrance. "We need to be quick." Jack nodded, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. They didn't know exactly what they were walking into, but they knew it wasn't going to be easy. As they edged closer to the building, Jack spotted a couple of men standing by the entrance, their faces obscured by the dim light. They looked rough, exactly the type of men Jack had expected to find working for someone like Braddock. "We'll have to wait them out," Mark whispered. "No way we're getting past them without a fight." Jack gritted his teeth, frustration building. They didn't have time to waste. Sam was running out of time, and every second they spent waiting could make things worse. But charging in blind wasn't an option either. "Let's find another way in," Jack muttered, nodding toward the side of the building. "There has to be another entrance." Mark nodded, and the two of them circled the warehouse, staying low to avoid being seen. As they rounded the corner, they spotted a rusted side door, barely hanging on its hinges. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than facing the guards head-on. Jack reached for the door, slowly pulling it open. The hinges groaned, but it didn't draw any attention. They slipped inside, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space of the warehouse. The air inside was thick with dust, and the faint sound of voices echoed from somewhere deeper within. "This way," Mark whispered, motioning for Jack to follow. They moved deeper into the warehouse, their senses on high alert. Every shadow felt like a threat, every sound a potential danger. But Jack's mind was focused on one thing: finding Sam and getting him out. As they rounded a corner, they spotted a group of men huddled near a stack of crates. Among them, Jack saw a familiar face. Sam, his shoulders hunched, his expression tense. Jack's heart raced. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. "Sam," Jack called softly, stepping forward. Sam's head snapped up, his eyes widening in shock as he recognized Jack. "What the hell are you doing here?" he hissed, glancing nervously at the men around him. "We're here to get you out," Jack said, his voice steady. "Come with us." Sam shook his head, fear flashing in his eyes. "You don't understand. It's too late for that. You shouldn't be here." Before Jack could respond, one of the men turned, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Jack and Mark. "Who the hell are you?" The tension in the room snapped like a wire pulled too tight. Jack's muscles tensed, and he knew. Things were about to get ugly. The air inside the warehouse seemed to freeze as the man's eyes locked on Jack. Tension crackled between them, thick and heavy, as Jack instinctively positioned himself between Sam and the men. Mark stood beside him, ready for whatever came next, his eyes flicking from one hostile face to another. "Who are you?" the man snarled again, stepping forward. Jack didn't flinch. "We're here for Sam. He's coming with us." The man sneered. "Sam owes us. No one walks away from Braddock without paying up." Sam looked at Jack, his eyes full of fear. "Jack, don't—" "Enough," Jack cut him off. "You don't belong here, Sam. You've got people who care about you, and you don't have to do this." The man let out a cold laugh. "You think you're going to just waltz in here and take him? You've got no idea what you're dealing with." Jack's jaw tightened. He had heard enough. Without another word, he stepped forward, his voice low and steady. "I don't care who you are. I'm not leaving without him." For a moment, the man hesitated, clearly sizing Jack up. The tension between them hung in the air, threatening to break at any moment. Then, without warning, one of the men lunged forward, his fist swinging toward Jack's face. Jack ducked, instinct and training kicking in. He dodged the punch and countered with a swift blow to the man's gut, sending him sprawling. Mark moved quickly, grabbing another of the men before he could reach for a weapon. The warehouse erupted into chaos, punches flying as Jack and Mark fought off Braddock's men. Through the scuffle, Jack kept his focus on Sam. He saw the fear in his old friend's eyes, the panic that came from being so deeply entrenched in something he couldn't escape. But Jack wasn't leaving without him. "Sam!" Jack shouted over the noise. "Get out of here, go!" Sam hesitated for a moment, torn between fear and the instinct to survive. Then, as another man lunged toward Jack, Sam made his decision. He bolted for the side door, disappearing into the night. Mark knocked down the last of the men, his breath heavy as he turned to Jack. "We need to get out of here." Jack nodded, his heart pounding. Together they ran after Sam, leaving the chaos of the warehouse behind. The night air hit them like a wave as they burst through the door, searching for any sign of Sam. "There!" Mark pointed down the alley where Sam was stumbling away. Jack sprinted after him, catching up quickly. He grabbed Sam by the arm, spinning him around. "We need to get out of here now." Sam looked at him, his face pale and shaken. "Jack, I don't know how to fix this." "We'll figure it out," Jack said firmly, his voice steady. "But not here. Let's go." The next few days passed in a blur of quiet tension. Jack had taken Sam to a safe place, away from Braddock's reach. Mark had stayed close, keeping an eye out for any signs that Braddock's men might retaliate, but so far there had been no movement. Jack knew they weren't out of danger yet, but for now, Sam was safe. Sitting across from Sam in the small, dimly lit room they had rented, Jack studied his old friend. Sam looked better, more aware, but the guilt and fear still clung to him like a shadow. "You don't have to stay in this mess," Jack said quietly, breaking the silence. "There's a way out." Sam shook his head, his voice heavy with regret. "I don't know if I deserve one, Jack. I've made too many mistakes." Jack leaned forward, his gaze steady. "We all make mistakes. You fought for your country, Sam. You did your duty. You deserve a second chance, just like anyone else. But you have to want it. You have to take that step." Sam met Jack's eyes, the flicker of hope returning, faint but real. "How do I even start?" Jack smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "With the first step. Come with me, Sam. We'll get you the help you need." Sam nodded, the decision made. It wouldn't be easy, none of it would, but Jack could see the shift in his friend. Sam was ready to take the first step back toward a life worth living. A week later, Jack stood on the stage at Foster Enterprises, the Veterans Program officially launching. The room was filled with reporters, business leaders, and veterans, all gathered to witness the start of something new. Andrew stood beside him, smiling with pride as Jack stepped up to the podium. For a moment, Jack hesitated, his mind flashing back to everything that had led him here. The struggles, the failures, the fight to save Sam and the others. But as he looked out at the crowd, at the veterans who had come to see what this program could offer, he felt a deep sense of purpose. "This program isn't just about jobs," Jack began, his voice steady and strong. "It's about giving veterans a chance to rebuild their lives, to find purpose again after they've served. We all face battles, some on the field, some off. But with the right support, with people who care, we can overcome them." As Jack spoke, he saw Sam in the audience, sitting quietly at the back of the room. Sam had enrolled in the program, ready to start over. It wasn't going to be easy, but he was willing to try. And that, Jack realized, was the most important thing of all. "This program is about second chances," Jack continued. "And no matter how far you've fallen, no matter how dark things get, there's always a way back." The crowd applauded, and Jack stepped back from the podium, feeling the weight lift from his shoulders. The program was real now. It was happening. And it wasn't just about saving Sam. It was about saving everyone who needed help. The weeks that followed were filled with stories of transformation. Veterans who had struggled to find their place after service were now building new lives through the program. Jack worked tirelessly, making sure that every veteran who entered the program got the support they needed. And slowly, the tides began to turn. As for Sam, he took things one day at a time. There were still bad days, still moments where the weight of his past threatened to pull him under. But with Jack's help and the program's support, he was making progress. He was rebuilding, step by step. Jack stood at the edge of the city one evening, watching the sun set over the skyline. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy for him or for Sam, but it was one worth walking. And that was enough. Jack's story reminds us that no matter how far we fall, we can always find our way back with the right support. If you know a veteran who's struggling, reach out, help them take the first step toward healing, and remind them that they're not alone. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and together, let's make sure that every veteran gets the second chance they deserve.